Good morning. My name is Cindy Seaton-Rogers. I am the Academic and Outreach Events Manager at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies here at UT Dallas, and I would like to welcome everyone who's been able to join us today. Just a note, this will be recorded and we can distribute that later for anyone who would like to have that. We will be sending that out. Before we jump into today's workshop, however, I want to go over just a couple of quick items. If you would, please make sure that you're muted and that you stay muted throughout the event. It would also be helpful if you could go ahead and stop sharing your video if you're not a presenter, so that we can maximize the quality of the video feed, because we will have more than one person as this is a panel. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the workshop. So go ahead and put whatever questions or comments you may have in the chat, and we will address as many of those as we can at the end. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Pedro Gonzalez Corona, who has organized this workshop. Dr. Gonzalez is a visiting assistant professor at UT Dallas, where he has taught both undergraduate and graduate courses focusing on the ideas of race and human rights. He was a visiting scholar in 2018 at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism at Oxford University, and he currently serves on the International Board of Academic Advisors for that institute. He earned his PhD in the history of ideas from UT Dallas in 2019 after successfully defending his dissertation titled Genealogy of Racism in Mexico, Technological Devices of Race and Their Transformation in Modern Mexico. And now I will turn things over to Dr. Gonzalez so he can introduce our panelists for today.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to see you here. I want to have a brief introduction as a preamble to the introduction of our panelists today. So thank you to the Ackerman Center and Dr. Romer for his support, as always. So here we go. This is a brief presentation that I wanted to share with you. Okay. All right. We may have to do with the with this type of view because the full presentation view doesn't always work. I don't know why. So let's use this one, if you will, please. All right. So I wanted to use a brief anecdote in consideration that anecdotes can be a powerful depiction of reality. And just a way of introduction, a thing that I remember from my teenage days is that my sister was of course, younger than me, and she loved this movie. So we watched this movie like 5 times at the time. We like the characters. This is the story of a mouse coming from Europe, arriving in New York, struggling to adapt and to understand the new mechanics of the country. And he goes through a number of adventures. Nothing wrong with it. He's really cute and sweet. And like I said, my sister loved the movie, so we watched it a lot of times. But I also remember that a few years prior to this early 80s era, I was watching cartoons, like many kids do. And we had the example of Speedy Gonzalez and his friends. So in my mind, that was somehow a contradiction, because I understood that, you know, these were products from a different country. And they were telling me perhaps that there's 2 different kinds of immigrants. The one that is going to be good, assimilable, and the other type that is going to be always different, speaks funny, is kind of backward, etc. And that message created a contradiction in my mind, because in my own country, in Mexico, and in some other countries in Latin America, that the story was different. The story was that we were like these kids, mestizo, meaning mixed. This is the example of a book that my mom bought me when I was 3 or 4 years old. She taught me how to read and write. And what she always said is that this boy was like me and this girl was like my sister. Oddly, the depiction kind of coincide with our physiognomies. So we love the book. And this is a later edition that we still used in Mexico to teach children how to read. That is no problem. The problem is that that's the beginning of a story, a narrative in which we are told that Mexican people need to be mestizos, mestizas, and we are the product of this idea and this process of mestizaje, which means the combination of two different people, namely the Spanish and the indigenous people in the Americas or Indians. Um, the story would not be complete if I don't mention that part of that narrative is the fact that you are shown this type of depiction of the indigenous people, right? An idealized ancient culture. You're supposed to be feeling proud about this. You have that inside somehow. You walk into any kind of a meat store or supermarket and you see calendars with this. This is really popular in Mexico. So it's kind of a national identity. Of course, that contradicts reality. In my trips to northern Mexico, I used to see people like this. Nothing wrong with living in the tradition, nothing wrong with living in the countryside. However, it was very different from the narrative that we got in the city. The explanation that we were just one people mixed all together, right? In reality, indigenous people were a lot different and they had different needs and problems. Throughout, my young years, I was also exposed to this that we call the golden eras of Mexican cinema, which now I can tell that reinforces the idea of being mestizo and belonging to the Mexican nation. So this is the general depiction of the Mexicanity, if you will. Men look like this. There's no contradiction between coming from the country, arriving in the city, improving your life, and of course, the physiognomy is gonna always point at the fact that you can always get um, better in terms of improving the race, as the saying goes, right? Being more somehow European, less dark, because after all, that's the aim of the idea of mestizaje, to hide something. In that tenor, in the 80s, this is when I was older, we also had this kind of show, right? This was a Que nos pasa, translates as what is happening to us. And they had a number of sketches, like a SNL style. And one of them, I remember it was Tomas. Tomas was always arguing with his mom because she had a tendency to have her mind in the gutter, and she used to think that he was talking about, inappropriate stuff. At the end of the joke, the punchline was that he was never intending to talk about, hypersexualized issues or things like that. And he ended up saying, "Oh, mom, your little black boy has a very white soul." This is the late 80s. And I don't think a lot of people saw what was wrong with the sketch. Especially if you consider that this is Hector Suarez, who played Tomas, right? A typical mestizo person who basically dominates film and culture in Mexico and Latin America. Another problematic issue related to this narrative of mestizaje can be found in books, in illustrated books, comics, such as this one. This is a classic. It was a beloved cartoon in Mexico until it created controversy recently. And you can see that the depiction of Black Mexicans is done in, well, in this the type of visual terms, along with other minorities, right, such as Chinese. but it doesn't apply to the rest of the characters. You can see that here the typical mestizo stereotype is it looks like a normal boy, his friends look normal, everyone looks normal, the teacher, except him. He is, in fact, a cartoon, a cartoonish representation. The exclusion does not stop there. This is another example of the controversies created when someone dares to speak against this type of depiction, right? So the famous snack produced by Bimbo, a huge transnational dedicated to baked bread and snacks and cookies, um, is this one, right? The negrito is like a well, you can see it here. It's like a Twinkie with chocolate on top. For many years, it was called this. It had this logo, and then when the controversy struck, then they changed the image to this one, which is equally problematic. And the problem goes beyond the product and the advertising campaign. The problem is that reaction, right? So here is the typical comment from Twitter telling us that in Mexico the 80s were better and that now people is offended easily by anything they see, right? They also had this type of bread which is called toasted bread, and it's already hard. It's like a cookie, and they used actors such as this one here to say that this bread didn't need to be toasted because it was born already toasted. So that was supposed to be funny and increase sales. So this is the overall look at how mestizaje creates exclusion. And to have a more detailed conversation, we have today two guests who are going to explain in more detail what is mestizaje about and how the anti-Black racism has worked throughout the years, especially in recent years in Mexico. That's why I welcome Dr. Jose Espericueta, who is an associate professor of Spanish at the University of Dallas. He received his PhD from Indiana University in 2011 in Latin American literature with a minor in history. His dissertation focuses on the colonial period in Mexico and questions the cultural and ethnic identity among mestizo populations. His research interests include transculturation, historical processes of colonialism, and Mexican national identity, as well as immigration and U.S. Latino populations. Among his multiple publications are Writing Virtue and Indigenous Rights, Juan Bautista de Pomar, and the Relación de Texcoco, and Juan Bautista de Pomar, and the Appropriation of Christian Discourse in Relación de Texcoco. Also joining us from Cambridge, we have Dr. Mónica Moreno Figueroa, who is a senior lecturer in sociology at Downing College. She received her PhD from Goldsmiths College in London, University of London. She is the co-founder of the collective Coopera, Colectivo para Eliminar el Racismo en México, which stands for, which means Collective to Eliminate Racism in Mexico. The collective has been developing a series of initiatives to make racism public in Mexico, to make racism visible in its multiple forms in the country, and to incorporate a race perspective in public policy and human rights activism. Dr. Moreno is developing various projects, among them Becoming Black, Gender, Racism, and Representation in the Costa Chica, Mexico, and also Institutional Racism and the Logics of the Contemporary Mexican State. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters. Thank you so much. Welcome to this workshop. I'm happy to see you and have you here. So I guess we can start by having a working definition of mestizaje before we go on. I already mentioned a brief outline, but it'd be good if we start with a working definition. So Monica, would you please help us?
Yes. Well, the way I think of mestizaje is almost like a multi-layer, concept that has a variety of definitions. One of them belongs to the historical process by which, we talk about the conquest and the colonization process in what then became the virreinato, but we talk about it like in that period where indigenous and Spanish people and other groups like Afro descendant peoples and Asian populations arrive, and this kind of mixture, right? So that's this mixture of population happened. So that's kind of one exception. But another one has to do with is there specific procreation between indigenous people and Spanish. So the offspring is called a mestizo. So that's another way of thinking of mestizaje. And the one that I use mostly, and I kind of play with all of them in my thinking, but the one I think is really important to bear in mind is that since the nation building process in Mexico, the notion of mestizaje becomes also a political ideology, a racial ideology used by the state. It becomes like the official racial project that kind of promotes a particular version of what the country is, what Mexico is, who are its inhabitants, and how that becomes a way of incorporating and trying to homogenize the population. So we talk about the mestizo becoming the Mexican, and therefore then the mestizo somehow is dropped. But that process of a racialized concept used as a national one is the one we're facing. So sometimes now when you see and try to analyze how racism operates in Mexico, you're going to see that the logics of mestizaje are constantly sort of appearing in scene, sometimes to refer to particular mixtures and the caste system and this skin color issue, depending on what sort of mixture you are from, and the question about improving the race and, you know, mejorar la raza, that comes from that history of mixture during the whole, colonial period and then afterwards, and the 19th century. And other times you are talking about this way of understanding this improvement as a constant whitening civilizatory project of improving the nation too. So it's a multiplicity of things, and it's a really important concept for me to analyze and understand how racism works, specifically in Mexico, which is different to the United States and to other places in the world. It has more alliances with Latin America. Not in all places of Latin America, mestizaje became an official ideology, but we can see that in Mexico is very much present as such. I hope that more or less, well, and it's mostly an assimilationist project that you can define as a racial logic that aims for whiteness and whitening the population.
All right, thank you. So having in mind those three different ways of looking at mestizaje, and considering that you did mention the colonial period as a way of departure, I would ask Jose, and this relates to your research, given the significant differences in their texts, biographies, and historical situations, what can be said to unite mestizos just, let's say, one generation after the Spanish conquest?
Yes, thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Monica, for the the definition. I like those very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I almost want to respond to some of the things you said earlier, which really brought up a lot in me too. But I know our time is limited, but I'm about to have a conversation about a lot of that. The one thing I think I would like to say before I start is just a reminder, the way in which those racial stereotypes and pop culture images, the role they serve, right? I think that they serve a very insidious role in keeping and otherizing populations, and in a sense, when they create a joke out of something, when they exaggerate things, it serves to blind people to the reality of the situations of people of color, of indigenous populations and of African populations when they're satirized like that. I think it's we grow up with them in some ways. It's a joke. And watching those, I thought of the cumbia music that I used to listen to as a kid when it was on the radio, and I would dance to it. And until you're older, you start realizing how racist it can be, or how colorist it is as well. These things are deeply embedded into a culture. And my own research being in Mexico too, and very much I'm in agreement with Mónica to the degree to which Mestizaje just flattens cultural difference. It proclaims unity and denies the indigenous population, or whitens it, or lessens its difference in some ways, and I think is very important. I want to say I think it's a term that needs a lot of problematizing, to the degree that we might think, especially in Mexico, it's such a powerful discourse from the early 20s, particularly after Vasconcelos and Raza Cósmica, sort of this point of pride for Mexican people in many cases, and an important one, and one that you can locate in its period, but one that is not aware of the diversity of Mexico's indigenous populations. And so I think for me, it's a term that needs to be problematized, while at the same time it's an idea that I very much like. When I consider my own Mexican American identity in this country, Mestizaje is valuable to me. And it's valuable to my understanding of myself. And so I think, while on the one hand problematizing, on the other hand thinking about this kind of practical mobility that not necessarily in terms of social movement or social progress, but just the very practical nature of being a product of two cultures, two languages, two histories, and in the 16th century, two worldviews, two religions, and all of these things. And what is that like? I embarked in my research as a graduate student, wanting to know, looking at the very uniquely different cultures of Spain and particularly the Nahua-speaking populations of Mexico. How would a mestizo unite these? And so I looked at mestizo authors, and we start my background is in literature, and students of Latin American literature, particularly colonial Latin American literature, read Garcilaso de la Vega, El Inca, right? And it's a particular view. I mean, it's a unique view, and it's located in Peru, and it's an individual who was born of the offspring of a Spanish conquistador and an Incan royalty. How does he navigate those things? And much of his work, much of his writing is a type of reconciliation between two cultures and an implicit advocacy for the importance of and the beauty of and the virtue of Incan traditions, but within a broader Western philosophy, right? Within a broader Western worldview all the time. So it's a lot of navigation that I found very interesting. Of course, my interests were in Mexico, and my kind of naive question was, what unites mestizos? What is the mestizo identity in the first generation when they're bringing together these two unique worldviews and languages and cultures? And the answer was soon very simple. They're different because people are different. And so the rest of my research became like, well, to what do we attribute this diversity? How do we understand this diversity? Why do we need to even say that they have to be the same? And just to skip to the end of at least that research, my interest was very much, identity is very local. Identity is still in the first generation after the conquest. You do have authors who engage in this type of navigation of different historical traditions, different epistemologies. But if we want to talk about an identity, I think we can question that. Like, why do we want to talk about like is it much of the studies of mestizo, the first generation mestizos, was like who are they and how did they see the world? And I think we could problematize that a little bit. But if we talk about identity, we should start by thinking about the local community, which at this point is still very much important. The Altepe, right? Mm-hmm. So many times when you think about Mexico in the conquest era, you think los Aztecas. Who are the Aztecs, right? Well, I think it's more important to sort of tease that apart a little bit and to look at these sort of independent Altepe city-states that had their own rulers, their own traditions. Many of them shared Nahuatl as a language, right? But they were in other senses very different, and they saw themselves very different as part of a community that was independent of other communities. The Aztec Empire was a confederation, was a loosely tied together confederation of three main Altepe. So in my researches, I looked at two texts from the late 16th century, from the 1580s, that were responses to a royal questionnaire, Philip II, in a sort of imperial bureaucratic desire to know as much as he could about the territories under his control, sent out these questionnaires for bureaucrats to respond to. And in the cases that I look at, two mestizos wrote histories of their respective Altepe. And I thought, well, this is the same context, right? You have two mestizos who are contemporaries, Diego Muñoz Camargo in Tlaxcala, Juan Bautista de Pomar in Texcoco. Two very different Altepe, two very different histories, at the same time writing in the same context, to the same royal audience. How do they position themselves vis-a-vis the Spanish king? And I wanted to see the similarities and I wanted to see the differences. And I think that what's important is that they both embark on this kind of cultural navigation in ways that suit them personally, that suit their local communities personally. They have different interests. And we can talk about those later on, but in the end, if we want to talk about their identities are Tlaxcalan and Texcocano. They come from these regions. Their concerns are about these regions. And I think that is very important, at least in my dissertation, and I can go beyond that later on, but at that time, my dissertation, that was a very important for me response to homogenizing the idea of mestizaje, that we're all mestizos. It's a mestizo nation, right? I remember presenting in a class, and I'll finish with an anecdote. Giving a class back when I was a graduate student at Indiana University, and we had a section called Los Hispanos Hablan, and we would invite people from the community to come and talk to our students about their Hispanic identity, so a Spanish person, a Mexican person, an Argentinian person. And a student asked the Mexican woman who came to my class, what is the type of racism, xenophobia you've received here in this country? And she spoke about that. And so I thought an interesting question to follow up. I said, so can you talk about what racism is like in Mexico? And her response was, oh, no hay. Es que todos somos iguales. And she touched her skin. She said, we're all the same. We're all the same. And I thought, wow, I mean, I far be it from me to, reject her idea at that time, but I think it's important. And I did follow up with my students, but that's really interesting. It's interesting that the extent to which we can internalize this idea of equality that allows us to ignore maybe some very real differences. All of this comes up. I can follow up on any of this at any point, but those are my initial thoughts about mestizo and diversity and indigenous populations as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Jose. So having in mind this diversity and how identity can be constructed in different ways according to the geography, the commerce of symbols, cultures, languages, etc. I would like to go back to Monica and ask the following: if it seems like to talk about anti-Black racism in Mexico is out of place, but how do we locate this type of racism in the Mexican context, especially under the light of mestizaje? Um,
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, maybe we can just retrace a bit and link the things with what Jose was talking about, because Mestizaje, as you know, you said very well, it flattens, right? It tries to flatten, and it's a very inclusive project that is trying to bring everyone into this fold of the nation. And it's a trap because it is no truth to that it's an equalizing, although it feels like, or it's sold as if it is. And for many, maybe it has worked to one extent, to a certain extent. So in that narrative, what Mestizaje has done, which is very damaging, is create a myth that, first of all, that indigenous peoples can be reduced to that term, indigenous, rather than honoring all their own names and their own nations. And also the other part is that then Spanish, which also has its own history and diversity and issues, those are the only two roots or bases of Mexican identity. It leaves out a very important, with a very important issue of Afro-descendant populations, but also others, you know, like Asian populations in Mexico and in Latin America more broadly. So I think that is important to have it as a background. I mean, all the things that you mentioned, Pedro, at the beginning with your presentation show how what happens when there is this flattening and then this denial that the race is relevant at all, then we let through a very everyday racism that is kind of seeping through like all of these different practices and issues, from representation, as you talked about, to, you know, the products, but a very strong racialization of the geographical space, a very strong racialization, of course, of bodies and skin colors. So the denial in the almost under the good pretense of inclusion and homogenizing has done great damage to our country. It has created a false illusion of equality and inclusion that has actually acted on a certain, you know, mystification and denial and delegitimation of people's claims. And of course, this has been debunked severely by the Zapatista movement in '94, which started already saying, okay, this project never worked. Look at us, look at our realities, that's not true. And it has kind of kept growing. And what we see now is that we have also, even since that time, but somehow it hasn't had as prominence as we can see now, which is the Black mobilization in Mexico. Although we cannot talk necessarily of a Black movement, we can talk that there is an increasingly growing strong as well, mobilization of Afro-descendant, Black, Afro-Mexican peoples that are trying to position themselves in this context, right, of a debate where they are somehow, at least publicly and explicitly, sort of not very much acknowledged, you know, somehow denied. Although I want to claim that that's not totally true. So I think that this is sort of giving, you know, a very interesting landscape where racism is being understood differently, where I think it would be more and more difficult that someone like the person that Jose described before would be able to say that so easily, hopefully. But still, that is the message, you know, and we are drilled that message by a very strong nationalist upbringing. We have to do honors to the flag every Monday. There's a whole ritual appropriation, you know, you are sort of drinking the nation all the time with all of these ideas. So something that happens when we try to talk about anti-Black racism is that, first of all, there's a reaction about like, what are you talking about? What racism? I mean, what Black people? There's no Black people in Mexico, which is of course not true. But that's a first resistance of the majority population. And what we have seen now is that since 2015, in the intercensal survey, and thanks to the organization of many of these movement of these Black organizations and their, you know, their insistence and work, is that the National Office of Statistics, or the equivalent, INEGI, took into consideration including a question of self-identification to test it, and it became used in 2015 and gave more or less a 1.2% population that self-identifies as Black. And now in 2020, with the national census, it was also included another question revised from the testing. And now we found that there is around 2% of the population who identifies as Black, Afro-descendant, Afro-Mexican. I mean, it's quite interesting already that you have, you know, all that many people from 1.2 to 2% suddenly appearing. No, sorry, maybe 1.2 million to 2 million. Maybe I'm not correct. Let me tell you with precision. Yeah, it was, 1.2%. Yeah, I'm right. So from 1,381,000 to 2,576,000. So you have more or less from 1.2% to 2%. And this population, you know, it's interesting because the 2015 data told us that 70% of those who self-identify as Black also identify as Indigenous. So that brings into question a lot about how it's very difficult to, in the Mexican context, to separate and to be able to say, these are the Blacks, these are the Indigenous, these are the Mestizos, these are the whites, because it's a continuum and it's a complicated mixture of experiences and years of taking in this national project. So we have then a Black population that is increasingly visible, made visible by this census and by all this mobilization, which I wouldn't be surprised that it's much more than this percentage, but that has to do with a national understanding that encourages people even more to come forward. It's a process, it's a social process, but it's also a social construction. The other part that is quite interesting here is how it's not just this, I mean, although the presence of Black people is now being sort of certified, the idea of being anti-Black, that is a very long-standing colonial process that derives from processes of enslavement in Mexico and a continuing disregard and disrespect of darker skin color people and the idea of Black. So it could be that a mestizo, like the ones who eat this bimbo food, or the ones who buy the Memín Pinguín book, have never met a Black person that is called a Mexican Black person. But they are very clear about what that Blackness means. And they very much would want to whiten their people, that, you know, their Mexican people are constantly being aware of the differences in skin color and are constantly worried about how that reflects on them and their families. And, that doesn't mean that mixture doesn't count. It's the bread of every day, in the Mexican context. However, the commentary, the hurts that all that insistence on, you shouldn't marry that person, you shouldn't be friends with that person, you can't hire the other person, who you're gonna love and who you're gonna despise, are very much connected to a racialized way of understanding everyday relations. So it's a very long answer, but I hope I kind of built on what we said and added more elements to this discussion.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much. When in my experience, when I teach classes on race and racism, every time that I talk about the mestizo, some kind of a confusion emerges because it feels like an attack on someone's identity, right? So we're talking, to be sure, we're talking about at least two very different things here. One is the process and the processes of an experience associated with a social unit, and the commerce, the exchange of anything from ideas, cultural productions, etc. And that is what Jose associates with the Altepec, right? It happens in different places. That would be associated also with, let's say, Gloria and Saldúa and the borderlands, and the capacity to understand different worlds and visions of those worlds. The other one is the nationalistic narrative, right? The one that whitewashes, obscures, and pushes away people consider a minority, of course, assigning value to that humanity, right? So that said, Jose, I would like to go back to you and ask you how those approaches to the mestizo shifted over time, and especially how does race factor into overall questions, let's say, of religious and ethnic difference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, race and the theories of race and the existence of the idea of race is a relatively modern concept, and so when you think of what a mestizo even means now, or what any race means now versus in the 16th century, you see a lot of big differences. What I think is important to keep in mind in the case of the Spanish conquest and of the colonial period afterwards is Spain's own context. The context by which Spain comes to the Americas is one in which they've engaged in their, what's understood as a reconquista, right? This idea that, from 711 to 1492, there was a Muslim, there were Muslim kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, and over time, Christian kingdoms at war. And it's worth saying, not always at war. Sometimes there was mixture, right? There's mestizaje in a sense in Spain too. So Spanish culture, I really like what Mónica said, and I think it's important to, is that when we think of mestizo, it's so important not to think of two things, like an American or a European. And clearly there's so much more in the American sense. There's a variety of immigrants. There's the importation of slaves, right? And mestizaje is a very broad thing, but it's also important not to assume one singular European, right? Or one singular Spaniard. And that Spain itself is a product of a lot of mixture. They bring their anxieties with mixture, with purity of blood to the Americas for sure. And they also bring a religious sort of zeal as well. These wars against Muslim populations sort of structure to a degree how they see what they're doing in the Americas as a venture for Christianity in order to expand Christianity. So really difference early on is not seen in terms so much of skin color, although I think difference at the time has to be really complicated, but on the one hand, it's very much religious. Very much in terms of Christian and non-Christian. That's one of the binaries I think that's really important, and how people identify, even legitimacy. So what's one thing that's very much common in any text that I'm familiar with, right, where either a native Amerindian writer is talking about the past, or mestizo is talking about the past, the profound importance is always placed on some sort of Christian legitimacy, to the extent that there's this kind of comparative ethnography. That'd be one way of putting it. Looking back at the past and saying, well, you know, if it's a glorification of the past, is to say, look how many Christian elements we had in our past, right? And certainly it's a cultural conquest of sorts. It's also navigation of the terms of legitimacy at the time. And this is especially in a counter-Reformation context in the 16th century, where Spain is trying to reassert the importance of Catholicism in contradistinction to the rest of Europe. Being faithfully Catholic Orthodox is one of the key terms, one of the key points of legitimacy. And so to the extent where you have native populations, native indigenous populations, speaking in very, very Christian terms about their past and their present, for sure, or distinguishing themselves with other native populations in Mexico, even neighboring indigenous populations, saying, well, they were less Christian than we were, or esos ahí son como los moros. And they draw religious distinctions between Christians and Muslim populations among themselves, always in justification or always in dialogue with Spain. I think at the same time, though, and I've been taking part in a lot of really interesting conversations about race recently, difference is so key in the conquest. Religious difference, newness, right? The novelty from the European, from the Spanish perspective of the Americas, right? Faces presents them with a lot of challenges, for sure. Epistemologically, how to explain, lands that are not part of their maps. But the question of the native person of the Americas and their humanity, this is a question that gets debated throughout the 16th century, right? Number one, recognizing that this isn't in fact Asia, this isn't in fact India, the Orient, and in fact this is a new continent. How do we approach these new populations? And those in favor of enslavement argue for their barbarism, argue for a lack of civilization, and categorize them as such, drawing back on Aristotle, conceptions of a natural slave. They're born towards servitude. And so discourses become formed to justify slavery, to justify the enslavement of indigenous people as subhuman. If you read Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, one of the Spanish chroniclers, one of the Spanish historians, his stories of what he terms the New World, right, are astounding. Where he says, I saw a Spaniard with a sword try to strike an Indio, and the sword shattered over their skull because their skulls are so different, right? Really, clearly, either it was a plastic sword, or it's just these discourses that are formed in order to continue justifying things like systematized enslavement, the encomienda process by which, and forced labor, essentially forced labor. I think, going back to the question, that really the religious component is a component that has to be understood beyond simply just faith, right? And it can be, certainly it's an important aspect of Mexican culture and of Latin American culture and of people's everyday lives. But I think we have to also see it as a subject position from which people would speak, and a terrain upon which legitimacy, rights was engaged upon. And so that's another thing, I think, a component that I'm particularly interested in that period, is really looking at religion as an imperfect terrain by which many questions were engaged. Yeah. yeah, I'm sure if I'm following up on all of the questions, I get kind of lost sometimes.
Okay, thank you, Jose. As you already noticed, what we're doing is zooming out, having a big picture approach, connecting the dots, because we cannot understand, let's say, what happens in the Costa Chica with the Afro-descendant populations if we don't take a look back at, the origin of these colonial ideas and components. Speaking of that, infrahumanity, right, that is central to those discourses. I would like to ask Mónica, because she has a text in which she relates the word asco in racism, anti-Black racism. Asco translates as disgusting, right? Disgust, revulsion. So the question would be, how can you explain that relationship between ASCO and anti-Black racism?
Yes, I would like to share quickly an image with you all. Can you see that? Yeah. So this is the phrase that inspired me writing this piece. And it comes out of a workshop where the participants at the end were asked to, after a process of discussing what racism is for them and how they experience them, to talk, to kind of put in a phrase how it has been for them, or a message they wanted to communicate. So this participant chose as a Black woman, and it was a group of Black women in the Costa Chica taking this workshop. She chose to write this, like a consequence of racism is that whites are disgusted by Black people. So it made me wonder, like, okay, what is disgust for, and what are its uses? What it allow us to feel, and what it allow us to do with it, what it save us from, and I think something that is quite interesting to me is precisely that anti-Black racism, it's the way in which many Mexican people and the national project itself saves itself, in a way, saves or tries to save itself from associations that wouldn't take them in this civilizatory project, in this modernization project, in this process of becoming a nation that it is a better nation, whatever, a more something, right? Which always insist in that reinstate that defective place that is supposed to be the starting point, that needs to be constantly improved. So this notion of improving the race is so entrenched, in everyday life, in everyday practices, in ways of thinking, that what it was clear to me when I was seeing this message was that actually disgust has been sort of like it's filtered through our veins, so that we monitor ourselves properly, so that we all understand where our alliances are and where not. I mean, very differently to the case of the US, where although we see more and more mixtures, mixed race people, what you have is more like segregated areas, where you have certain, the Hispanics, or Black people, white people, etc. But what you have in Mexico is a very different scene. And I want to actually show you and just share with you these images, which I think kind of help to understand what we're talking about, the context of Mexico. So, I mean, those pictures are of my family in Mexico. So what you see here is a a mixture of, this is what we talk about when we say mestizaje. And I think it's important sometimes to bring the images, and I'm happy to share my own. So to see that this is a family, you're not going to run away from the whiter or from the darker. I mean, we are all sort of living together, and within that we learn very quickly who is the lightest, who is the favorite, who is the darkest, and who has to struggle a bit more, and who has to make, I mean, that doesn't take away, of course, you can have very deep, and as any family, strong, loving relationships. But the experience, in my case, of being a Black girl within a mestizo, a mixed race, you know, a mixed family, was that it was very clear that my physical being, you know, was somehow disconnected, or there was some distance, and that it was almost seen as, you know, well, a problem that can be solved. No? So my grandmother would say, you really need to marry a white man so your children are not so dark. And that would be the way, you know, she did all that work and that effort. And, you know, so she succeeded. My grandmother is here in the middle. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I moved the picture. So this woman here, who succeeded with some of her children to become lighter, and others, you know, did this thing of marrying darker, and, you know, so she was very, very concerned about that and saying, you know, I'm trying here, you should all help. And it's quite interesting. I'll stop that. Because what it tells us is that these stories run really deep, and, you know, and when we want to, even when we want to take this to the US, I mean, my problem with sort of elevating the mestizo figure in one place like the US, and you know, seeing it as this, so distinct from the Mexican, is that we forget that these are the things with which migrants travel, right? This stuff that, of course, it comes and collides with a different race model, that it is segregationist, that it has a very different sort of narratives of violence, of racial violence, say, towards people. But the ones in Mexico are as violent, you know, are as difficult, because it's a very distinct, specific, you know, ways. Yeah, it's very specific, and it has all of these other histories, right? So the use of affect is so deep that it really molds people's sensibilities, you know? It's like when someone says, I really like blonde women, for example, or, you know, las güeritas, you know? So when someone has this deep love, you know, and when someone has this deep preference that they can tell you, no, it's not personal, it's not racist, it's just like, I really feel it in, you know, it's just my preference. That has been subjective, it's a subjectivity that has been formed and shaped by a whole history where that disgust, you know, it's ever present, right? It's telling us, you know, you should strive for that. And it tells us, of course, that the basis where you're starting is a mistake, or it's wrong, or it didn't come out right. Because, of course, the mestizaje premise is that, which is, of course, a fiction, but that's the myth, is that if you marry with a certain people, then your children are going, you know, that's the kind of logic, are going to whiten. But what happens when it doesn't? And in a family, you see it all the time. So it doesn't happen necessarily, because of course that's not how the bodies and science, and not science, the bodies and nature, whatever, works. But this idea is that the genes of Hernan Cortés are gonna come out in my family, you know, like they are gonna really work their way through. Whiteness is gonna really work their way through. And that creates a lot of tension and stress. And it does impact. I mean, although here I'm talking at the micro level of the family and individual relations, this is multiplied. In the family, we have a microcosms of society. So it multiplies in terms of who you want in your to work with, who is going to be your friends, who are you going to favor, who is going to be left to have birth in the corridors of hospitals, who is going to be given oxygen or not for the COVID emergency, who, etc. So it sort of, it doesn't emanate on the family, obviously. It's a multiple flows, you know, it comes from big structures, it reproduces in these levels, and, you know, it is a continuous flow. But what I want to point out is that discussed in this sense, it's very much serving a purpose of directing the gaze of people towards whitening and away from black, you know, and dark. And there I want to sort of mix indigenous, and I'm not saying that anti-blackness doesn't include indigenous, but I think it's very important to see how skin color plays a role here. Because although I'm a mixed race person, if I came out looking like my mother, we would be having a different conversation. But because I came out looking like my father and I look darker, therefore there is a sense that, oh, I should be in the black section. You know, I have to talk about the black section. So, but it just happens, you know, it's not something that you can't predict or control. So, very long answer again, but I hope it's...
Thank you, Monica. All right, I need to say something really sad. We are approaching our final round of questions. So we're running out of time. So I would like to ask Jose for a final remarks, and perhaps what do you think is missing in this conversation to understand the process of creating an identity known as a mestizo, which is a reality of combination of multiple components. And then again, what is missing to understand mestizaje as that steam roller that does the opposite and hides individuals and identities. What do you think is missing as a final remark?
Yeah, well, my response to that is very specific, and it really in the space of my own research. And so I'll give a quick response and then try and offer some kind of closing remarks. I think, in particular, and this is in response to where things have gone in studies of the mestizo in the 16th century, very, very specific. Not just the mestizo, but also the native Amerindian subject as well. If we are trying to understand sort of, one, I think it's very hard to talk about identity in the 16th century, and there's a lot. And I think part of the baggage of that is intellectual baggage, where a lot of academics have looked at these questions in very, very binary ways up until very recently. And they look at writers, and the question is often, are they acculturated or do they resist? And those questions get put on mestizos as well as indigenous, right? So I think that I think has been rightfully challenged in a number of ways. But what in terms of the fluid ways identity can be navigated, it's not just you're not either un español puro, which is not a thing, right? Or un indio, which is also not a thing. You come from a family, you come from a clan, you come from an altepet, and there are a lot of components that go into how you conceive of those things. I think it's more productive at this point, in my view, in looking at some of these early writers, to think not sort of like, how do we categorize them? Certainly we can make observations about them and ask questions about them, but rather what were the spaces in which they were able to speak, and what was the language that allowed them to speak, that allowed them into the terrain of broader discourses. And I think for me, the one question in that case, in this very specific case, is what alliance, where do they fall in terms of the religious orders at the time? It's a question that I don't think is sufficiently asked. The religious orders had a lot of power in this time, sometimes were at odds with right? Mexican, Dominican, what can discourse.
Mm.
Oh, Jose,
Very important politics. And my view is that what is missing is my internet may be coming in and out. My view is that what is missing is strategic alliances that are made in order to further the interests of the individual. And I'm so grateful for this conversation. I'm getting so much out of it. One of the reflections I have in listening to Mónica is the extent to which really the African slave suggests a lot of inconsistencies, particular in the moral arguments at the time. You have, this figure like Las Casas, who originally he's like heralded as this major figure for human rights, and early on in his advocacy for indigenous populations and for their rights not to be enslaved, the question is, what is the economic future like for Spain then? And he says, well, African slaves, right? So he has this view of just a sort of moral philosophical view of what should and should not be done in terms of the American Indian. And then, well, somebody has to mine the gold, somebody has to work in the plantations, and he does move away from that. But I think that inconsistency, that moral inconsistency, is very important to recognize. And so much of that is at the heart of race in Latin America at all. I mean, you have the caste system later on, which is a response to mixture, but is a response to the larger presence of African slaves and African peoples in Mexico and in Latin America. And I can't help but look at even the comments that are made now, or the things that do happen in our families, where someone, a child is complimented in my own family for their beautiful skin color. Say, oh, what beautiful skin your son has. I mean, they're saying how white your son is. There's nothing else there. Or qué bonitas, qué ojos más azules. It's all one sentence. She's so beautiful. She has such blue eyes. Where does that come from? And I think you have to trace the roots all the way back, and that color and legitimacy and all these things are intertwined with colonialism and intertwined with labor, and all of it functions together. And I'm just so grateful for this conversation, that we've gotten so much out of it. So I'll finish there.
All right, thank you, Jose. Yeah, there's words that substitute other words, right? And in my case, being told and educated grants me a ticket to a certain wideness, right? That I would not have if I was back in not only in Mexico, but in the environment that people recognize as different in that type of epistemological relationship with words that substitute negative traits. That's what I'm trying to say. Negative traits that are substituted by others, like in the case of the association with the ASCO, whitewashing, pointing in a different direction and all that. So I'm going to remind our public that we're going to finish soon. So if they have any questions, and especially if you can be really specific and concise, we're going to appreciate it, so they can start posting in the chat. Last question for Mónica. You speak, talking about this type of substitution in language, about lo negro. That would translate as the black or blackness, or so what would be the differentiation between that lo negro or blackness and the black people, to understand racism, anti-black racism in Mexico? What would be that differentiation?
Yes. Thank you. Well, I think I kind of already mentioned some of those aspects, which I will take again and also push a little bit maybe more. But I mean, what I mean by that is that, and this kind of aligns with Afro-pessimist literature that suggests that we need to take into consideration the way in which ideas are present in everyday culture and everyday life, and that that doesn't necessarily, is not the same as the people. So what we found in Mexico is that both of those things operate. There is a structural disadvantaging of Black populations that live in very marginalized areas, or that have had to go through these processes of mixture, therefore sort of cutting as Mestizaje sort of takes over, cutting with those past, the same as indigenous peoples have done through centuries. And so you have that population. And on the other hand, you have this idea of improvement that I mentioned before. That is that, and the idea of that whatever is lo negro, you know, whatever is this, whatever things associate with, you know, Blackness need to be sort of distance from. I mean, the problem is, why I want to make this distinction is particularly for Mexican people who would say, I am not racist, I don't deal with Black people, and actually we're very nice to Black people. I mean, there was a case with Memín Pingüín, the ones that you, the cartoon that you mentioned, that when they were issued these stamps in 2005 to commemorate the cartoon, the centenary of the cartoon, of the comic in Mexico, and they issued these comics, these stamps of Memín Pingüín, there was a very big intervention from the US with different actors kind of saying to the Mexican government and to different, it was a media storm, and it was, you know, like, that's racist, why are you using those images that are so controversial? I'm gonna show them while we, so that people that don't know them can very quickly locate them. So I'm talking about these images. So when they were issued, lots of intellectuals, Mexican intellectuals, came to the rescue because it seemed like this sort of the sacred space of nationalism was being broken by US intervention and coming to say to Mexicans they were racist. And what you find is that, for example, and I'm just gonna, if you can see this slide, Elena Poniatowska, Carlos Monsiváis, Enrique Krauss, big intellectuals in the Mexican scene were saying things like this, you know, Elena Poniatowska saying, in our country, the image of Black people, you know, makes or awakens a very huge empathy or sympathy that is reflected not only in characters like Memín Pingüín, but also in popular songs, and talks about Cri Cri, which is a musical a songwriter for children, that who wrote a song called El Negrito Sandía, you know, like black watermelon. And in Mexico, differently to what happened in the US, our treatment to Black has been more loving, tender, I don't know, how would you translate cariñoso? And Carlos Monsiváis said that all this was just the willingness of the US people to transfer their racism to another society. And Enrique Krause said that Memín Pingüín was a highly pleasant image of Mexican popular culture. So I think that tells you a little bit about how, you know, the idea of Black, you know, the idea of blackness and of the idea, the use of these texts is ever so present, you know, it's very present. And it's molding interventions, it shapes interactions. And I think it's important that we notice, and I say this for the Mexican population overall and our understanding of that, that if we don't take that on board, it would be very easy to not see how racism is being reproduced and present now, right? So I think anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Asian racism are the three main pillars of mestizaje and racism in Mexico. And in this case, specifically anti-Black racism, what it does as well is to solidify the national project and this belief in a mixture of two roots, you know, that it has only these indigenous as a whole and European Spanish as a whole. That, and so I think it's really important to break that down. That's a myth. And it's not only that, I'm not saying here that there are three roots, you know, because that's also another idea that the third root is, I don't know about the roots, but I think there are many populations that historically have formed part of the country and we have believed in a lie, really. Mestizaje is in a way a lie because it is proposing an idea of a country that's not there, that is being produced with that notion rather than it being what we can, you know, see and understand and experience, you know. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Monica. We have about 5 more minutes, very rich 5 minutes. So do you have any questions for each other? Something that you would like to ask each other? I've been asking the questions, of course, but they were based, of course, in your research and in comments. But anything that you would like to ask each other before we leave, or while we wait for someone in the public to post a question?
Well, I would like to ask Jose, if in your research, have you found Black people in your research? Looking at Indigenous people, do they come across, are they, I mean, we know that they came with the colonizers from day one, even if the slavery process started a bit later, but I don't know.
Yeah, and like the case of Estebanico, who's with who comes around with Cabeza de Vaca and is part of his travels through the southwest of the United States. My research is pretty limited in the 16th century to central Mexico and in this particular area, but I think overall, more broadly, in terms of looking at the question of race and how it's created over time, it's the African slavery is unavoidable. It's unavoidable because it's a point by which race becomes more crystallized as it becomes a broader part of the society, right? But in terms of the limitations of my research, is very specific to Texcoco and Tlaxcala and the way those things work out, the way those histories are written and all of that. But like I said, terms of difference that the most fundamental terms of difference in these points, they're not based on, they're not founded on race or even necessarily skin color or anything like that, or phenotype. It's so much of it is religious, to the degree that we can see, if you wanted to say that it's racialized. But I think for me also, it's the later history of Mexico, and the way in which when you follow the caste system that's created through time is so interesting, and it's an example of the interplay between institutional racism and individual racism, and how theories become sort of assimilated into people's thinking. That's a separate interest of mine that I think is fundamental to Mexican racial composition. I have a question for you too, but I see that there's one in the chat, so I wanna leave it for now.
Thank you. We have a question. It's for Mónica. And let me read it, translated because it's in Spanish. Instead of
disgust
is hate, what a lot of people feel against those who have dark skin.
Well, I don't know. I think maybe we can say it's a multiple of feelings, you know, and I'm sure hate might be part of the equation. I guess I wanted to make a point of disgust in relation to mestizaje and the way this sort of going away, you know, this process of trying to improve the Mexican race, or the, you know, trying to improve and make kind of better, the betterment of the Mexicans, has to do with having to have embedded a sense of, I do not want to have your children, I don't want to mix with you, I want to go away from you, I want to clean this blackness and this indigenousness, this dark indigenousness. But because it is in a context as well of mutual, you know, convivencia or spaces, I think that hate will operate more in spaces where segregation is much more current, I think. So when we talk about Islamophobia, and when we talk about that, the idea of hate sort of comes there more prominent. But I wouldn't, I mean, I think it'd be very interesting to just to think about all the range of racialized emotions that come into the interactions. And I would say maybe more even fear, you know, fear is very much associated with Black people as being, you know, scary criminals, you know, angry, that version, which I think also happens in Mexico. But I wouldn't know if it wouldn't sort of help my argument as much. But it is not exclusive, the argument I'm making. It's just I'm using that to make that point.
All right. So it seems like ASCO is more like a dispositive, like a technology, right? That operates somehow deeper under the radar.
In the article, I talk about it as a referee, you know, almost that is saying like, do not come this way. Direction is that way, and is organizing, you know, how mestizaje should work, you know. Right. And mestizaje works towards, it's a whitening process. And maybe just going to what Jose was talking about, alliances as something missing, this doesn't mean that we cannot reverse the processes of mestizaje. I mean, and this is what we're seeing with Black population and Black people. This number that increased in the census is because more people are saying, oh, well, maybe I do have Black ancestry, you know, and they are kind of going the other direction. And it also happens with Indigenous people, that people are saying, I'm going to claim back my Indigenous, you know, parents, my grandparents, my language. I want to rescue it. So it can also be that. And I think we are now able to explore that.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we are actually out of time. So this conversation was great. I appreciate it a lot. Through your answers, we were able to deconstruct in a literal manner these ideas and discourses that have, excuse me, created on one hand a nation, but on the other prejudice and violence against those who are not welcomed by the definition, the categorization, the abstraction, right? So thank you so much for being here. I think the topic and the discussion requires us to plan another meeting to keep the conversation going. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you. I enjoyed it very much, and I hope our public enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Pedro. It was lovely talking to you. Muchas gracias
Gracias a todos
por la
y a
invitación.
todas.
Thank you, everyone. Gracias, Elia, por la pregunta.
Real quickly, I see that Saul is still on, and he did put a question in the chat, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to address that if you don't mind. Can you see the chat, Dr. Moreno? The question that Saul asked about El Chavo?
Yeah. I mean, I think El Chavo del Ocho is such a racist show that I'm so happy they didn't have a black character. It would have been just a disaster. Very much like the one that Pedro showed, the one of Hector Suarez. So yeah, many people relate to it. It is a very mestizo sort of the mestizo lower class, world that is ridiculed really. That is not, it's a classist, sexist, racist program that should be banned from the earth.
Well,
Although
now I won't bother looking it up because I had never heard of it, so I wasn't sure what it was, but I will save myself that particular wonderful. Well,
all Mexicans, I mean, of my generation, we grew up watching that every week. I mean, and that's what's shaping our sensibilities, very deep-seated, racist, sexist. I mean, it's just awful. I didn't remember it, but he died recently. So I was like, oh, he died. And I started looking again at some in YouTube. I was like horrified. I just didn't remember how bad it is.
Yeah, he's Cindy. He's the guy that has another character that wears like a red suit with the yellow heart.
Yeah, that's El Chapulín. Yeah.
Yeah, it's famous. They have like cameos in The Simpsons, and it has been appropriated by people in United States as a symbol of our Mexican identity and so forth. But if you look back at the episodes, it's really problematic. Yes, like Monica says.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. This was it definitely gives everybody a lot to think of. Somehow y'all managed to put such a complex issue into just over an hour. So
yeah,
thank you for that.
So, sorry, he left before.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and end the meeting, but thank you so much. And
all right.
Pedro, I'll call you on Teams if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Gracias, Mónica.
De nada.
Hasta luego. Bye bye.
Gracias, Pedro. Qué gusto.
Igualmente.